Please turn in your Bible to 1 Peter chapter 2. This is where we will spend our time today. I don't want anybody to misunderstand me this morning when I say some of these things, because it can sound like I'm making a statement I'm not trying to make. I would say it's really good to read the Bible. Let me just start out that way. That'll clear up some of the misunderstandings that could take place. But there are hazards in some respect in reading the Bible. And I'll cover some of those hazards as we go through this text today. Good to read it, good to become familiar with it. The divine Jonathan Edwards in New Hampshire, who was one of the preachers who was part of the first Great Awakening here in this country and in Europe, took 2 years, and all he did every day was read the Bible. He read no newspapers, no magazines, no nothing. All he read was the Bible for 2 years. He just felt called to do that. And I would say that's a good calling to have. Nothing wrong with it at all, especially someone as trained as he was. But reading it and becoming familiar with it, though very good to do, is not as good as taking the things that are in it and making them applicable to the smallest areas of life in which we conduct ourselves. The problem we have with doing that, and I'm going to expand on this today as we go through this sermon, is I believe deep down we really doubt whether God's going to come through for us if we do just what that hymn said, trust and obey. I remember Ronald Reagan said of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, we're going to trust, but we're going to verify. Let's take a look at this text and see what it would teach us. 1 Peter chapter 2, I'll begin reading in verse 13. Be subject to every human institution for the Lord's sake, whether to a king as supreme or to governors, or those he commissions to punish wrongdoers and praise those who do good. God wants you to silence the ignorance of foolish people by doing good. Live as free people, not using our freedom as a pretext for evil, but as God's servants. Honor all the people, love the family of believers, fear God, and honor the king. Slaves, be subject to your masters with all reverence, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are perverse and harsh. For this finds God's favor, if because of conscience toward God, someone endures hardships in suffering unjustly. For what credit is it to us if we sin and are mistreated and endure it? But if we do good and suffer and so endure, this will find favor with God. For to this we were called, since Christ also suffered for us, leaving an example for us to follow in his steps. He committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. When he was maligned, he didn't answer back. When he suffered, he threatened no retaliation, but committed himself to God, who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might cease from sinning and live for righteousness' sake. By his wounds we are healed. For we were going astray like sheep, but now we have turned back to the shepherd and the guardian of our souls. Now there's a ton of theology in this text, and I'm going to focus it all in one little spot, so I hope I'm successful in doing that. What does it mean to live for Jesus? Well, if Peter's right here, it means we're to emulate him as we find him to be, and we're to do as he would do, think as he would think, as much as it is possible. How do you do that? Well, the only way I know to do it is to take the Gospels and go back and look at Jesus' life and see what we could learn about how it is we are being commanded then to live. That means becoming familiar with the texts. So we're right back where we started. It's a good thing to read the Bible in this way. But it's easy when reading the Bible to become academically engaged with it and not at all engaged with it in terms of how it's going to change the way in which we live. And I can speak to that. I've done it for 6 years. 6 years I've been academically involved with the Bible. So the academic, take it from me, is not always life-changing. It's just not. Much harder to find the effects of the Bible in one's life in terms of the concrete way in which we live our lives. So, if we're going to gain knowledge about the Bible, what should we gain knowledge about? Well, the first thing we need to gain knowledge about, if Peter's correct here, is the ministry of reconciliation. That's what we're commanded to do, right? Go make disciples. What does being a disciple make a person? It makes them reconcile then with God. That's what we're commanded to do. But if we're going to take the Bible seriously in any way toward how it personally affects you and me, it's going to cost us something. That's just all there is to it. Now, I remember, and the reason I say that is so many, and I'll get into this a bit later, see becoming a disciple as an add-on to the life we've already got. And it's not. I remember, if any of you in this room have ever read the Chronicles of Narnia, I've read them probably, I'm going to guess and say 10 times, maybe more, maybe less, but somewhere in that neighborhood. C.S. Lewis's little collection of 7 children's books, well, they may have been written for children. They do not read that way. They read almost as a theological treatment about what it is to live in this world connected to God. In the books, Aslan, the lion, is the Christ figure throughout all of the books. And in the books, Lewis is very careful to give Aslan a character that exactly matches the character we see in God in the Bible. What is that character? Well, he's perfectly loving, but he's perfectly just. And he holds those two things together in perfection, infinite perfection. On the one hand, I could see where God being perfectly just is a scary proposition because it's absolute and ruthless. His justice is absolute and absolutely ruthless. There's no, it's kind of like the picture I get is that of a hydraulic press. A hydraulic press, whatever it's rated at, I mean, you've got them that are rated at hundreds of tons. If you put an egg in a hydraulic press, it's going to be as thin as the molecules when the press comes together, when the two plates come together, and it's absolutely ruthless. There's nothing that can resist that press. God's justice is like that. But then there's also Paul who says God gives us a spirit where we look at God and we call out to him, Abba, Papa, Daddy. The toddler's way of referring to their father on the earth. So those two things are absolute and perfected in God. And you see this in the Chronicles of Narnia. The children are all taken to Narnia by various means, through the wardrobe or however they wind up there, and they are commissioned to doing tasks. And one of the children, in one of the books, I can't remember now, comes to a lot of the animals in Narnia can talk. You may not be aware of that, but they can. And one of the children comes to Miss Beaver. She's a beaver, and she talks. In that, she's been commissioned to do something, and she went to Aslan for some help, and Aslan was completely ruthless with her in terms of her, you are to get on with that. And the little girl asks Miss Beaver, why did Aslan respond that way? And Miss Beaver just looks at her and says, well, you know Aslan's not a tame lion. Well, God is not a tame God. He's not. We come to God, and his character is absolute and fixed. He may, and I know this is going to shake a lot of people up, he may respond to us in a different way by changing his mind about how he works in time. But his character will not change ever. And that's something we just have to recognize. That's why Solomon says the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. So we look at the world and we think about justice in our terms. And our terms, we talked about this in Sunday school a bit today, they always feel good when we see something we think is just done. Somebody does something wrong, they get punished, it feels good to us. I remember it felt good to me on 9/11 in a perverse way, I confess this, that they died on those planes. Now, that's a terrible thought, because these guys, if they didn't know Jesus, and there's every reason to think they did not, and lots of other people on the plains as well. That justice awaits them, of God's absolute justice. That's not a good thought. But I'm just like anybody when it comes to the hero. If the hero kicks butt, I'm happy about that. Takes names and cracks heads, you know, that kind of thing. With bad people, that feels good to me. But it's not God's way at all. It's hard to trust God's character in this world. And I'm saying that as one who would like to think I do trust it. But it's hard. Because a lot of times this idea people say, oh, what goes around comes around. That's a lie. There are lots of people who get away with it their whole life. And it never comes around. Right? So, if anybody deserved justice, I can think of one biblical character who absolutely deserved it, and that was Jesus. But he didn't get it. He was treated unjustly from start to finish. He was put to death for that which he never did. And then you've got the disciples. They're walking with him for 3 years. And they come through Samaria. And the Samaritans say, no, you can't pass this way. You're going to have to go around. And what did the disciples do? They come to Jesus and say, hey, you want us to call fire down from heaven on their heads? That's justice, right? They treated us badly. Let's punish them. And Jesus says, you don't know what spirit you are of. God has a very different view. And yet, for you and me, this goes back to us applying these things in the small areas of living. You know, the small areas are the hard ones. The small areas of applying the Bible to our lives and living it out, those are the hard ones. It's easy. Take, for instance, things we've done right here in this church. Now, I'm just going to say this from my perspective. Sorry about that if you disagree, and you can. But I think it was easy to decide to help the Mets when they needed help. Their child was dying of cancer, and this church took them on to help them. I didn't find that hard to do. Did you? It was easy. But it's really hard to not have a knee-jerk reaction when someone mistreats me. And to respond in a way that Jesus would never allow. That's hard. Easy to do the big things, hard to do the little ones. Go into a restaurant. I was with some people once, and you all have seen this. Maybe you've done it. I don't know. I probably have. If I think really hard, I could probably think of a time when I've been just this way. Bring the meal out, waiter or waitress doing the best they can, busy. They set the meal down, they got it wrong. Real wrong. Or it's cold. Or the portions don't look right. Whatever. What's our response? I was with a group of Christians once, this is years ago, and I just looked at, in the moment, I didn't know what to say or how to even think about this. But a person I highly respected just crawled that waitress for everything she was worth. And you know what the response was, the justification? I'm paying for it. Right? That was after the waitress left, this person, he or she, kept on talking to us about the fact that they were justified in their anger because I'm paying for it. So easy to do. So easy to do. Hard to just do the right thing in that instance that Jesus would have us do. And I don't think it would be that. We suffer temptation. We find it difficult to take into our lives the portion of who Jesus was, where he did not, as Peter says, he suffered, but he maligned no one. He was maligned himself, but he did not retaliate. I look back at Jesus' life, and one of the things that strikes me, and I'm looking at it from my own perspective, you know, you go back to Matthew 4 and Luke 4 where Jesus has to go through the temptation. Satan takes him out, shows him all this neat stuff, says, look, you're the Son of God. Why don't you just take care of this? Make the stones into bread if you're hungry. Jump off this cliff and the angels will take care of you. Show us how really supernatural you are. And Jesus, of course, responds by never taking it upon himself to act in any of those ways. But I look at it from my perspective and I say, if I were stuck with that situation, marched to the edge of a cliff and told, jump off, God will take care of you, right? I would be standing there looking over the edge and thinking, I wonder if God's going to come through here. Are you going to come through? Think about the Columbine shooting and the little girl. I don't know her, but one of the two shooters comes up to her and asks her, this was witnessed, it was documented, the people were there, are you a Christian? And the answer was going to determine whether the gun was going to go off in her face or not. And she said yes, and the gun went off. Is God going to come through? From an outward perspective in that instance, I would say he did not. Now, I know that he did. But I wonder what the people who were watching all that who didn't believe think about whether or not God came through. And that's our fear, is that we will commit ourselves to something, even the small things, and we'll take justice upon ourselves because we're not sure that God's going to come through. And you know, sometimes that coming through takes a lifetime. I mean, why do you think Paul speaks to husbands and wives and says, look, if your husband or your wife's an unbeliever and they mistreat you, that you put up with it for the sake of conscience toward God, God may use that to change their life. But from the perspective of being within it, is God coming through? Doesn't look that way, does it? Looks like he's not. Mortimer Adler. I love this story. I love stories like this. Mortimer Adler, the philosopher, you may not know who that is. He became a Christian at 82. 82. Isn't that something? Got born again at 82. He writes this: there's a great gulf between the mind and the emotions. I was on the edge of becoming a Christian several times, but I didn't. I said that if someone is born into a Christian family, they can be lighthearted about living up to the Christian demands. But if somebody is converted by a clear conscious act of their will, as an adult, as he was, one had better be prepared to live a truly Christian life. He says to us, so ask yourselves, are you prepared then to give up all your vices and weaknesses of the flesh? Is God going to come through? I remember I was talking to somebody once, I won't say who or where, but I walked up to their vehicle, and they were in their vehicle, and I wanted to speak to them because I knew them. And I walked up, and I looked in, and they were looking at a pamphlet, very innocent pamphlet having to do with something that they were interested in, an article of hardware. And the pamphlet, of course, used the modern means of sexual attraction to make the sale, right? Pretty scantily clad women, it was women, and this person was a man, looking at these women. And we got into a conversation about several different little things, and I saw the pamphlet too. Don't feel like I'm just the pure as the driven snow standing aside and not noticing that the women were pretty and scantily clad. They were. And somehow the conversation between myself and this person turned to what was on the page. And I said, you know, isn't it terrible that we go through this world and we are constantly confronted with that which would cause us to have flights of sinful fancy? And he looked straight at me and smiled and said, but isn't it fun? Peter says this in the admonitions. He says, honor all people. That's not terribly hard to do unless they look different, unless they don't dress like we think they ought, unless they're in sin. Do we honor them? Love the body of believers, he says. We do that okay, pretty well, although sometimes those believers have political notions that are so violently opposed to ours that we can't seem to find the measure of strength to love them. So Peter's kind of wasting his breath there sometimes. Fear God. That one's pretty easy. most of the time. Although, I'll just say it like it is. I know I live in my life and I do things, think things, look at things, entertain things in my head that act as though God's not even there. Do we ever do that? Just go like my friend in his flight of fancy with the pamphlet. Just go off in places like God's not really paying attention. Honor the civil authorities. Well, that's hard. You know why? Because they look just like we do, and we know who we are. And so it's very hard to have somebody as a civil authority in charge when I know they're just as fallen as I am. Submit to those who are in authority, even though they may not deserve it. And that's very hard for us in this country. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness gets infringed upon sometimes by the very people that are supposed to protect it. And it becomes very difficult for me to submit to that authority. But Peter says I should. And then you think about salvation. When we come to salvation, I mentioned this earlier on, I want to expand on it just a little bit. We come to salvation with expectations, don't we? We come to salvation and we look at discipleship in our self-focused way as an add-on that's going to make life better for us. Now, Paul says to Timothy, godliness leads to profit. So I believe fully, that if a person who is living a disparate life, a life of, you name it, alcoholism, addiction, whatever it is, if they truly are born again, that it's going to be profitable to them in whatever it is from which they suffer. I agree totally. But we don't look at it like that. We look at it like, hey, if I get born again, my life's going to be better. Well, where do we find that in the Bible? I mean, I think about John the Baptist. John the Baptist, if we saw John the Baptist today, we would think that he was something out of one of the weirdest TikTok videos we could possibly find. We wouldn't think John the Baptist to be someone so connected to God that we would respect him in the way that Jesus seemed to respect him. I mean, what does Jesus say? They're talking to him about John the Baptist. And he says in Luke 7, he says, what did you go out there to see? A reed swayed by the wind? No, you went out there and you saw a rock, and a scary one, who didn't wear nice clothing, who wore rough clothing, who lived in a way that one could only say was otherworldly. That we as nice, decent Christian people probably would look at and think, can't be possible this person knows the Lord. So what does all this have to do with us? Well, there are parts of being a Christian that I'm just going to tell you straight up I do not like. I don't like them. I do not like the fact that Jesus says I'm the way, the truth, and the life, and nobody comes to the Father but through me. Because I look at people all over for whom that's not a truth and who suffer because of it. I do. They do. I mean, you take this congregation, if we had a homosexual couple who was in here week in and week out, they would be suffering to a degree just because Jesus says, sorry, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father but through me. I don't like that. I don't like the fact that if a person doesn't agree with Jesus as the Bible portrays him and they die in that condition, God says they're going to spend eternity in hell. I don't like that either. I don't like the fact that the Bible seems to be rather explicit when it comes to things about choices of living, that the homosexual couple is living in sin. I mean, I'd rather just be kind of live and let live. I'm a nice guy. I don't like to see people hurt or suffer or be accused of something. I don't like that, but I've got a Bible that tells me I can't look at it quite that way. Last week, remember I said, if I look at someone, or you look at me, let's take it that way. You look at me and you say, Rip, you are wrong in what you're doing. That's not a judgment, and it's not a hard thing that's being said to me. It's actually a compliment to me. You know why? Because by saying it, you're telling me you think I'm better than that. That's what you're saying. I think God feels the same. A couple of weeks ago, I was in the jail talking to the prisoners. And there was this guy sitting next to me. He was all inked up, covered in ink. He had piercings in his face, and this guy was probably 45 years old. He had piercings in his face that they won't let you have those in jail. You have to take them out. So all the piercings were healing. And he was big. I mean, this guy was this wide. My height, but this wide. And it wasn't because he was overweight. I mean, this guy was a rock. Scary looking guy. And he looked at me, sitting right next to me on the bench. He says, I have anger issues. And I looked over at him, and this is what I said. I said this exact words. I said, you're kind of big, bigger than I am. You're not angry with me, are you? Everybody laughed. You know, even he laughed, which is a testimony to the Spirit of God living in him. And he looked over at me, and he looked over top of his glasses, and he said, I need Jesus to make me less angry. Now think about what he's saying, and think about the simple purity of that statement. He's not asking the world to change so that he can live in it. He's asking Jesus to change him so that he can live in the world. So familiarity with the Bible is a good thing. But if it's academic, it can numb us to the things that God would point his finger at us and say, here you need to be different. I need to be different. Are we really sensitive to God's leading in those affairs of living, the small affairs? Seeing people as God sees them is very difficult. You know why it's difficult? Because to do it, it's going to cost us something every time. Always. Something we're going to have to let go of. A prejudice, a self-protection, a feeling of safety, and worst of all, we're going to have to let go of that which we have invested in our whole lives, the notion that we think we're right. And I'm going to be just like the prisoner for myself and say, God help us. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray.